The beginning of the abyss, as we understand it, does not lie in the crumbling kingdoms of later ages, nor in the ambitions of fallen kings or serpents twisting fate to their own ends. It begins in the quiet, forest-edged kingdom of Oolacile, in the final years before its light was consumed. Canon tells us that Oolacile was a place of refinement, a land where sorcery favoured subtlety over power, illusion over brute force. Their magic bent light and shadow to soften the world, to cradle it, never to dominate it. And yet, in a moment of hubris encouraged by a serpent who knew how to whisper just enough truth to make deceit meaningful, the people of Oolacile disturbed a grave that should have remained untouched. They awakened Manus, the primeval human, the ancient bearer of a fragment of the dark soul, whose grief and fury warped the very notion of reality. It is said that when Manus was roused, his wild humanity erupted outward, gathering itself like a storm-given shape. That eruption became the abyss. To understand this, we must first remember that humanity within Dark Souls lore is not merely a trait or condition, but a substance, a force, a fragment of the Dark Soul itself carried in every being descended from the first human. Each humanity sprite found throughout the world is a condensed piece of this primeval essence. When Manus awoke, this essence roared outward in its rawest form, unrefined, uncontrolled, and unbound by the limitations that later ages would impose upon it. The darkness that poured from him was not a void in the simple sense. It was humanity overflowing, magnified beyond containment, responding to grief with the same primal intensity that once shaped the earliest souls. Oolacile was the first to witness what happens when the human heart loses its boundaries. Streets, once lined with golden banners, collapsed under masses of writhing shadows. Inhabited minds turned inward and became distorted, twisted into forms that mirrored fears buried too deep for speech. The sorceries of the people, designed to comfort and illuminate, could do nothing against the wild humanity that bloomed across the kingdom like a devouring night. Even the warriors trained under the tranquil canopy of the royal wood found themselves consumed before they could understand what they faced. The abyss did not destroy as flame does. It did not burn, nor rot, nor corrupt with poison. It overwhelmed, filled, and replaced. It entered where fear lived, growing strong in the space where light once softened the edges of thought. The legends tell that the abyss spread faster in Oolacile than fire across tinder, because the people of that kingdom had never known true darkness. They had cultivated a magic of gentle illusions, bending light so that the world always appeared softer than it truly was. And when the abyss rose, this long-standing denial of harsh reality became the perfect soil for terror to take form. Under the influence of Manus's humanity, illusions fractured into nightmares. The more an Oolacile sorcerer resisted seeing the truth of what they had awakened, the more distorted their mind became, until their bodies mirrored the panic they tried so hard to suppress. As the abyss deepened, its nature revealed something unsettling. It was not an external enemy, not a force imposed upon the world by cosmic accident. It was the world's own shadow, its memory of what it had been before the first flame divided life into light and dark, heat and cold, strength and frailty. The abyss represented a return to unity, but a unity that came at the cost of individuality. It absorbed distinction. It smoothed away identity. Those who fell into it did not simply perish. They were unmade, dissolved into the mass of undifferentiated humanity that roiled beneath its surface. The terrifying truth hidden within these events is that the abyss was not created by Manus alone. He served merely as the catalyst, the spark that allowed the dormant humanity within all beings to awaken violently. The people of Oolacile contributed to its growth through fear, denial, and the collapse of their illusions. It is here that we must consider the deeper meaning of humanity's role in the world. In the age when the first flame first divided the primordial state of existence, Gwyn, the Witch of Izalith, Naito, and the furtive pygmy each received a Lord Soul. The pygmy's Lord Soul, the Dark Soul, was divided, again and again, into fragments that became the essence of humanity itself. This division spread the Dark Soul across countless lives, creating a species defined by resilience, by adaptability, by the quiet persistence that can outlast gods. And yet, that very resilience came with a vulnerability. When concentrated or inflamed, humanity could distort the world around it with overwhelming intensity. Oolacile learned this lesson too late. As Manus's anguish grew, so too did the abyss. And those who witnessed him described something profound. He did not lash out with calculated malice. The darkness recoiled and surged like a wounded animal desperate to reclaim what it had lost. Some scholars within later ages believed that the abyss's violence was not an expression of hatred, but of desperation. Manus reached endlessly for something taken from him, something that embodied a memory of warmth or comfort. His human side, magnified into monstrous scale, yearned with the same intensity that defines humanity's deepest attachments. To those who stood within that roiling darkness, this yearning took the form of violence, because it had no language gentle enough to express itself. It was in these final days of Oolacile's collapse that the kingdom called for aid beyond its borders, summoning a knight whose legend would echo across time, the one who would later be called the Abyss Walker. But before that arrival, before any hope could be restored, the abyss spread unchecked through every street and corridor, revealing how fragile light becomes when the darkness beneath it awakens all at once. In this moment, the world saw the first true manifestation of the abyss, not a place, not an enemy, but a consequence, a reflection of humanity's unresolved depths. And yet beneath it all lies a quieter truth, one that often slips unnoticed between the lines of legend. The abyss is not merely the domain of monsters, nor a punishment for forbidden acts. It is the shadow of humanity's own origin, stirred to life by grief, too vast to contain. Before the abyss became a curse, before it spread into the hearts of kings and kingdoms, it was simply the human soul without restraint, yearning without limit, grieving without end. In the recorded memory of Oolacile, long before Manus stirred and before the abyss began to thicken like a storm cloud beneath the soil, there was a belief, quiet but absolute, that humanity had transcended its own shadow. The people of this gentle kingdom cherished sorceries shaped from light itself, bending radiance into illusions so refined they became indistinguishable from truth. Their libraries, carved into pale stone and illuminated by soft amber lanterns, held centuries of thought dedicated to refinement, restraint, and the elevation of the mind above primitive emotion. They celebrated clarity, order, and the idea that through cultivation of the intellect, one could rise beyond the old fears that once defined mortal life in the wake of the first flame. Yet this was the foundation of their downfall. In forgetting darkness, they forgot themselves. Every chronicle describing the kingdom's final days agrees on one point. Oolacile did not understand what they had unearthed when they disturbed Manus. They believed they had discovered something ancient, perhaps a remnant from the primordial age. But they did not recognize the nature of the dark soul woven through that slumbering corpse. Humanity had grown so accustomed to the comfort of their crafted illusions that they no longer recognized the raw truth of their own essence. Manus's awakening was not merely an encounter with an external force. It was a confrontation with a reflection that Oolacile had spent generations trying to forget. A mirror in which the true shape of the human soul moved in restless, unrefined patterns. As the abyss seeped through the streets, The response of Oolacile's people revealed something more tragic than simple terror. They tried to reason with it. They tried to illuminate it with spells designed to soften and soothe. They cast illusions, meant to impose order on what had no desire to be ordered, no inclination to be civilized. Their sorcery, delicately spun and beautifully structured, dissolved instantly against the surging tide of wild humanity that Manus radiated. The magic that defined their culture could not survive an encounter with the very thing it had attempted to suppress. And in that collapse, a deeper truth emerged. The abyss gains its strength from denial. Where people refuse to turn toward the darker corners of their nature, it gathers. Where they cling to comfort at the expense of truth, it grows. The survivors who wandered aimlessly through the corrupted groves spoke of voices whispering through the air. Voices formed from their own thoughts, magnified to unbearable intensity. Some cried that they heard their childhood fears made audible. Others claimed the abyss replayed memories they had refused to confront. In this way, the darkness that engulfed Oolacile acted less like a spreading infection and more like a revelation of the inner self. When their minds fractured under the weight of thoughts they had buried, their bodies reflected that break. They transformed into shapes that echoed their internal distortions. The abyss did not strip them of identity. It amplified what was already there. To understand why Oolacile fell so swiftly, we must return to the earliest ages of the world. When the first flame appeared, dividing existence into light and dark, the gods who found the great souls chose light to define their power. Gwyn built cities of holy radiance. The Witch of Izalith forged fire into magic. Nito held dominion over death itself. But the furtive pygmy, who received the dark soul, retreated into obscurity and divided that soul among countless descendants. Over ages, this fragmentation produced a species of beings whose hearts held something the gods did not: the capacity for endless change. Humanity carried within them the unending potential of the dark, and with that potential came emotions too powerful for the gods to comprehend: grief, longing, despair, and hope. All of these forces stirred within Manus when Oolacile unearthed him. His humanity magnified these emotions until they became physical forces, bending the air into trembling waves and warping trees into shapes that mirrored his anguish. Some ancient scrolls describe Manus as the primeval man, not because he was the first human in a literal sense, but because he embodied humanity's essence before civilization, before restraint, before self-control. He was humanity without walls. And when he was awakened, every barrier built by Oolacile's refined culture collapsed beneath the weight of that primal truth. As the abyss expanded, the land underwent changes that scholars across ages struggled to describe. Forests that once shimmered with delicate golden-green foliage darkened into tangled masses of writhing black. Flowers wilted not from rot, but from the overwhelming presence of humanity, saturating the soil, as though emotions too vast for any one being had spilled outward and settled upon everything that lived. The creatures of Oolacile, gentle and timid in their natural state, transformed into silhouettes of terror, their shapes contorted in ways that hinted at fear rather than malice. The abyss did not create monsters. It revealed the monstrous shapes that fear itself could assume when magnified without restraint. There were reports of sorcerers who clung so tightly to illusion magic that the abyss shaped their bodies into living parodies of their own spells. Men and women whose illusions once glimmered with calming light now shimmered violently, their forms bending as though made of fractured lenses. Their limbs elongated in unnatural ways, mimicking the distortion of perception that comes with panic. Some dissolved entirely into formless shadows, murmuring half-coherent apologies to an audience that no longer existed. In these transformations, we see another truth of the abyss. it shapes what it touches into reflections of human emotion. The more one resists, the more violently the reflection twists. Manus himself, in the heart of this collapse, became a vortex of wild humanity. Descriptions of his presence speak of hands, countless hands, reaching outward through the darkness, grasping for something lost. These hands were not instruments of cruelty. They were expressions of desperation. Some ancient analyses propose that Manus searched for a memory, a comfort from a time before he was consumed by isolation. The darkness he produced did not spread because he wished to conquer. It spread because humanity, when driven to extremes, cannot contain its own longing. His power magnified that longing until it spilled over into the entire kingdom. Oolacile's failure was not in its strength, nor its intelligence, nor its magic. Their failure lay in believing the human soul could be shaped only by light. Throughout history, they had woven illusions to soften every edge, to remove every shadow. They believed that progress meant distancing themselves from the darker aspects of existence. But by doing so, they forgot how to face the ever-present truth that the dark is not an external threat. It lives within every fragment of humanity. And so, when the darkness finally awakened in physical form, they had no defenses. Not because they lacked power, but because they lacked understanding. The tragedy deepened when Oolacile attempted to stabilize the chaos by amplifying the very illusions that had made them vulnerable. Some sorcerers gathered in desperate circles, weaving light spells in hopes of reconstructing the world they knew. But the abyss, fed by fear and the denial of reality, swallowed their magic and used the remnants to twist the land into even more unsettling forms. Light, when used to deny truth, becomes fuel for the darkness it attempts to conceal. Those who escaped the initial collapse wandered into the royal wood, seeking refuge. But even the forest, once serene and filled with gentle rustling leaves, transformed. Trees lost their color and stretched impossibly high, their roots forming shapes that resembled outstretched fingers. Animals, driven by instinct, fled deeper into the shadows, only to emerge twisted and trembling when the abyss reached them. Survivors told stories of shadows that whispered in familiar voices, calling them by name, urging them to return. It became clear that the abyss did not simply devour the kingdom. It consumed memories, reshaping them into lures that entangled those who tried to flee. Oolacile's knights, though trained for defense, were unprepared for the emotional reality of the battle they faced. Their weapons met no resistance in the darkness. Their armor provided no protection against despair. Some knights, upon encountering creatures warped by the abyss, recognized traces of faces they once knew. Friends, mentors, family. To fight these beings felt like striking at memories themselves. Many hesitated, and hesitation in the abyss was fatal. Others fought desperately, but with each strike, the darkness absorbed their resolve and reflected it back as growing futility. The fall of Oolacile is often depicted as a swift catastrophe, but in truth, it unfolded like a slow unraveling. Day after day, the light in the kingdom's sky dimmed until even noon resembled twilight. The abyss rose not as an invading army, but as a tide of human feeling left unchecked. Entire districts faded into shadow, swallowed without a sound, while the remaining citizens clung to fragile hopes that rescue might come. Some prayed to Gwyn, believing that the Lord of Sunlight would send aid. Others whispered that the gods had abandoned them long ago. Yet amid this devastation, a single thread of resistance endured. The belief that someone might still answer their desperate call for help. Their hope, though flickering, reached beyond the borders of Oolacile. And when that hope finally found its destination, it brought forth a knight whose legend would stand against the abyss itself. Before the abyss ever reached the crumbling spires of Lanedell in distant ages, before it pulled kings from their thrones or swept across drowned kingdoms. It first sought out those whose souls already leaned towards silence, ambition, and the eternal whisper of the dark. To understand how the four kings fell and why their downfall became a template for every kingdom that followed, we must begin with a moment easily overlooked in the grand chronology of the Age of Fire. It happened quietly, without the spectacle of war or prophecy, in the deep stone chambers of New Londo, where four monarchs ruled with dignified reserve. Their fall was not born from greed or treachery, as later legends often claim. It began with a question whispered into their hearts at a time when the first flame had already begun to dim, even if no god yet dared to admit it. The four kings were once human rulers elevated by Godfrey himself, chosen because they possessed not only strength, but restraint, the ability to wield power without drowning in it. New Londo was built upon that principle. Its soldiers maintained order with discipline rather than brutality. Its priests studied the flow of souls rather than the caprice of divine decree. Its nobles spoke more often of civic duty than of ambition. And the four kings presided over all of this with the calm confidence of those who understood the responsibility carried by their station. In these early years, their souls glowed with clarity, shaped by loyalty to the gods and devotion to their people. Yet even the most steadfast rulers can feel the creeping shift of an era. As centuries passed, subtle changes spread across the world. Flames burned with less intensity. Shadows lingered longer at dusk. The distance between the gods and the people widened as Anor Londo dimmed. In the silence left behind by fading divinity, mortals began to notice their own thoughts more sharply. Questions rising about the nature of souls, of destiny, of whether the fire's radiance could truly endure forever. The four kings felt these questions pressing at the edges of their minds, faint but persistent, like the first tremors of a distant quake. It was in this climate of quiet uncertainty that the primordial serpent Koth approached them. He did not arrive with armies or through force. He emerged in the deepest halls of New Londo like a patient thought given form. Koth spoke not of rebellion or conquest, but of truth, a truth the gods had hidden since the first linking of the flame. He told them of the dark soul, that ancient gift passed to the furtive pygmy. He described how humanity, long dismissed by the gods as lesser beings, carried a spark that could outlast the brilliance of fire. The four kings listened not out of ambition, but out of curiosity. Their duty was to their people, and if the dark offered a future where their kingdom might endure beyond the decline of fire, they believed they owed it to New Londo to consider it. Here lies the tragedy. They did not choose the abyss. They chose hope. Koth offered them the power to draw souls with unparalleled efficiency, to siphon their essence, refine it, and channel it in ways no human had ever achieved. He claimed this gift would prepare them for the coming Age of Dark, an era when humanity would no longer live in the god's shadow. To rulers facing a dimming horizon, the offer must have seemed almost noble. They envisioned a future where New Londo would survive whatever upheaval the waning flame might bring. As they accepted Koth's gift, dark tendrils wound their way into their souls, not as poison, but as possibility. This was the first step. At first, nothing seemed amiss. In fact, the four kings grew more radiant, their forms elongated subtly, becoming more ethereal as their connection to the dark soul deepened. Their voices carried a resonance unlike anything known among mortals. Their sorcery, already formidable, shifted in tone, glowing with pale violet energy instead of the traditional blue-white hue. Their people revered them more than ever, interpreting these changes as signs of divine favor. Yet beneath this veneer of grace, a quiet transformation had begun. Koth's power did not corrupt them in the simple sense. It awakened something dormant within their souls, humanity, concentrated beyond natural limits. As this wild humanity stirred, it fed upon the king's sense of responsibility and magnified it into obsession. They began to see their rule as indispensable. They felt a growing belief that only they could shepherd their kingdom through the coming darkness. This sense of purpose, once humble, twisted into an overwhelming burden that even their enhanced souls could not withstand. Here we see a pattern echoed later in Oolacile. When humanity intensifies without restraint, emotion becomes power, and power becomes distortion. The four kings began siphoning souls not to strengthen themselves, but to prepare for an age they believed only they could endure. Souls flowed through New Londo's chambers in quantities never seen before. Citizens began to whisper of strange lights beneath the city at night, of voices echoing through stone corridors long sealed. Some said the kings no longer walked with the steady step of mortals, but drifted as though gravity no longer remembered them. And in time, their physical forms began to unravel, shedding shape as their humanity-swollen souls drew them toward a state beyond the mortal plane. The abyss did not erupt violently here as it had in Oolacile. It seeped. It accumulated like water, rising beneath floorboards until the foundations of the city trembled. The darkness beneath New Londo grew thick and almost liquid, a mass of humanity that slithered through cracks and pooled in forgotten chambers. People disappeared. Some were consumed. Others, touched only lightly by the spreading abyss, wandered the streets mindless, whispering the king's names as if reciting a lullaby. The four kings did not intend this devastation, but by the time they realized what had been unleashed, the boundary between their souls and the abyss had already dissolved. The moment they were fully claimed by the abyss was quiet, almost peaceful. Their bodies lost all definition, stretching into tall, wavering silhouettes crowned by pale, spectral crowns. The light that once defined their presence dimmed into a cold radiance that resembled neither fire nor sorcery. They became reflections of humanity stretched to its breaking point, beings who had surrendered their individuality to a single, all-consuming idea that they must survive at any cost. The people of New Londo had no champion strong enough to resist this spreading darkness. The abyss here was not fueled by pain, as in Manus's case, but by misguided devotion. It filled the city like a rising tide until even the stone walls groaned with pressure. When the threat became undeniable, the city's sealers made a decision as terrible as it was necessary. They opened every floodgate, allowing the waters to swallow New Londo whole, sacrificing the kingdom to contain the darkness. Thousands perished, and the drowned city became a monument to the dual nature of humanity's potential, its brilliance and its peril. Yet even beneath the arcing waters, the four kings endured. The abyss preserved them, holding them in a state of suspended torment, neither alive nor dead. They had wanted to shepherd their people into a new era. Instead, they became guardians of a void they could not escape, drifting endlessly in the dark, waiting for the rare soul brave enough or desperate enough to enter their domain. What makes their story especially haunting is that they never hungered for domination. Their tragedy came from devotion, not greed. They accepted Koth's offer to protect their people. In doing so, they forgot a simple truth. When humanity grows without balance, it becomes a sea without shore. And in that sea, even kings drown. Long before later ages spoke his name in hushed reverence, long before statues crumbled in his honor and legends polished the rough edges of truth, Artorias was known simply as the knight who would confront the abyss when no kingdom, no god, and no force of order could endure its touch. The tales often depict him as a figure of absolute certainty, a flawless champion of light striding fearlessly into darkness. But the truth beneath the myth is far more human, far more fragile, and infinitely more tragic. To understand Artorias is to understand the precise moment when the struggle against the abyss ceased to be political or philosophical and became something deeply personal, born from a recognition that if one man didn't enter the dark, the world itself would be swallowed by it. When word reached the Knights of Godfrey that Oolacile had fallen to a force unlike anything the annals had recorded, the reports must have sounded almost surreal. Descriptions varied wildly. Some spoke of shadows given form, others of grief thick enough to choke the air, others still of blackened shapes writhing with inhuman, tortured humanity. Yet amid these conflicting accounts, one detail remained consistent. The catastrophe had begun with the awakening of Manus, and the abyss now spread outward from him as if pulled inexorably toward every flicker of mortal emotion. It was not a foe that could be reasoned with, nor a curse that could be lifted. It was something fundamental. It was humanity turned inward upon itself. Artorias was chosen not because he was the strongest of Godfrey's knights, though he was undeniably formidable, nor because he possessed some unique immunity to corruption. He was chosen because he carried a soul shaped by an unusual clarity, a kind of inward steadiness that allowed him to stand where others faltered. The legends speak of his valor, of his blade skills and his unwavering purpose, but these embellishments obscure the truth of his greatest strength. Artorias understood fear. He understood grief. And unlike the sorcerers of Oolacile, he did not deny these truths. He did not build illusions around himself. He accepted them. This acceptance would become both his weapon and his downfall. Before he journeyed into the abyss, Artorias forged a pact with the creatures of the deep woods, beasts bound to the root systems of ancient trees, guardians of the forest that skirted the corruption. These beings did not fear the abyss, for they had no illusions to shatter. Their minds were not shaped by civil ambition or the comforts of crafted light. They lived close to the primal truths of the world, and so the dark held little power over them. Artorias swore to protect them, and in return they aided him, guiding him into the depths where even the sun's memory faltered. This covenant, created at the threshold of corruption, gave him what no sorcery could, a path. Every account of his descent into Oolacile describes the same transformation in the air. As he moved deeper, the world became less a place and more a sensation. Light dissolved into trembling fragments, as though clinging to existence out of stubbornness. The trees, stripped of their former grace, swayed like silhouettes, submerged in water. The ground rippled faintly beneath his steps, as if the soil itself breathed with the rhythm of some unseen pulse. In this environment, the abyss was not an enemy, but an atmosphere. It seeped into armor joints, into the spaces between thoughts, into every whisper of doubt a soul carried. Artorias carried his doubts with discipline, yet even he felt the weight. Knights trained under Godfrey were taught to confront external foes, but nothing had prepared them for a battlefield made from emotion itself. Fear thick enough to drip like liquid, sorrow spreading in cold waves, longing echoing like distant thunder. The abyss mirrored every unspoken thought, amplifying it until it became a landscape of its own. And so, the deeper he travelled, the more he had to rely on his resolve rather than his strength. Some say he spoke aloud as he walked, not to proclaim heroism, but to anchor himself. Simple statements, reminders of who he was and why he had come. A knight of Godfrey, bound by honour, faithful to the living and the lost. These words steadied him, kept the abyss from overwhelming the inner architecture of his spirit. In this way, Artorias fought long before he ever raised his sword. The creatures he encountered were twisted reflections of the people of Oolacile, humanoid forms stripped of identity, driven by panic so intense it had become instinct. They lunged not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for release, for some external force to silence the storm inside them. Artorias met them with sorrow rather than anger. His strikes were clean, swift, and merciful, more like gestures of mourning than acts of battle. In every fallen form, he saw not a monster, but a fragment of humanity that had lost its shape. As he approached the heart of the abyss, Artorias discovered something unexpected. The darkness did not merely swallow light, it shaped itself according to the presence entering it. Each step revealed a landscape subtly altered by his own thoughts. Where fear stirred, shadows thickened. Where determination rose, pathways opened. And where grief flickered, the air trembled as though awaiting confession. The abyss was not empty, it listened. It was here that the true cost of entering the dark became clear. By drawing closer to Manus, Artorias felt the pull of that primeval humanity, like a gravitational force. It tugged at his memories, at the quiet vulnerabilities he carried, at every wound he had ever buried beneath his discipline. The abyss recognized him, and recognition is always the first step toward corruption. Accounts from later ages describe the moment Artorias realized he could not defeat Manus alone. The darkness swarmed him with such force that even his unmatched will could not hold back every tendril of wild humanity seeking entry into his soul. His shield arm faltered, his breath grew heavy, the ground beneath him rippled violently, and in a desperate act that has echoed through legend ever since, he used his own shield, blessed, tempered, and sworn to protect others, to guard Sif, the loyal companion who refused to leave his side. That single act revealed the full depth of his character. When faced with an enemy that could not be slain by blade alone, he chose to protect rather than destroy. He placed his faith not in triumph, but in sacrifice. The abyss surged into him in that moment, recognizing the fissure created by compassion. Darkness poured through him, not in rage, but in resonance. For to care deeply, even in defiance, is to open the heart wide. And an open heart, in the abyss, is a gateway. As wild humanity overwhelmed his soul, Artorias did not crumble in fear. He raged against the dark, not to save himself, but to buy a few more breaths for the innocent life he had shielded. His body twisted under the weight of the corruption. His movements became erratic, tormented. The knight who entered the abyss with purpose now staggered, struggling to distinguish enemy from illusion, memory from nightmare. In this state, he fought anyone who approached him, not out of hatred, but because he could no longer recognize the world he had come to save. That is the true tragedy of Artorias. He was not defeated by the abyss. He was overwhelmed by the depth of his own humanity. Even in his corrupted state, fragments of his former self flickered through. Glimpses of resolve, echoes of vows, movements shaped by the discipline of years. But the abyss, merciless in its reflection of the inner self, magnified his turmoil until it broke him. Artorias collapsed, leaving behind only a trail of wild humanity that drifted like black embers in the still air. Yet the world remembers him not for this fall, but for what followed. His sacrifice created a fragment of hope, an ember small enough to be overlooked, yet potent enough to change the course of history. For someone else would enter the abyss after him, someone carrying neither divine mandate nor knightly title, someone who would walk the same path, face the same wild humanity, and confront Manus in the place where Artorias' story ended. But the abyss does not let hope pass unchallenged. It tests every flicker of light, every step taken toward its center. And in the wake of Artorias' fall, the darkness only grew hungrier. before the abyss swallowed the last lantern glow of Oolacile, and before the legend of Artorias hardened into a tale retold by trembling bonfire light, another kingdom had already been touched by the same slow, inevitable gravity of humanity unbound. Its fate unfolded miles away and years before Manus ever stirred. Though time in these matters follows no true sequence, for the abyss recognizes patterns rather than chronology. It finds the same weakness wherever humanity gathers, in great number: fear, ambition, yearning. And so, long before the cries of Oolacile reached the ears of Godfrey's knights, the great city of New Londo had already learned the price of trusting the dark too deeply. New Londo did not fall abruptly. It did not crack open in a single night of terror. Its death came as all quiet tragedies do, piece by piece, as individuals made choices they believed to be righteous. The four kings, touched by the serpent's counsel, had already allowed wild humanity to seep into their souls. But the people who served them still moved about their days, unaware of the transformation building beneath their feet. They continued to trade along the river that cut through the heart of the city. They gathered in the great stone hall to hear the kings speak, and they knelt in hushed reverence as priests recited prayers older than memory. Their trust was unwavering. Their rulers would guide them, as they always had. They did not yet understand that the abyss grows most swiftly where trust remains unquestioned. At first, only subtle signs hinted at the spreading corruption. Lights flickered in the lower districts, though no wind stirred. Shadows stretched a moment too long before snapping back into place. Dogs barked at empty corners. Some citizens described an oppressive feeling in the air, as though the atmosphere had thickened, making breath heavy and shallow. Others claimed they heard whispers rising from cracks between cobblestones, whispers that seemed to mimic their own thoughts. But life continued, because people learned to ignore the strange when it threatened to disrupt the familiar. The abyss began its quiet work, not through terror, but through complacency. The king's new powers, granted by the serpent, soon became visible. They could draw souls with a grace that defied mortal capability, shaping them into energies neither sorcery nor miracle had ever produced. Their displays astonished onlookers. Ribbons of pale violet light flowed from their hands, twisting in elegant spirals that filled the chamber with shimmering currents. People believed their rulers had achieved a divine advancement, an evolution of human potential. And in that admiration, the kings felt justified. Their choices, however risky, seemed to bear fruit. The serpent's words felt increasingly true. Yet these demonstrations hid a growing fracture. The kings felt the pressure of every soul they absorbed. Their wills strained under expanding weight, their emotions amplified without warning. A fleeting worry became dread. A minor hope became consuming ambition. Their humanity, normally a flame within the furnace of identity, had become a storm spilling beyond its vessel. Wild humanity demands expression, and, within the kings, it found none. So it seeped outward, slipping through the halls of New Londo, shaping the world according to the echoes of their burden. It began first with the knights. The guards stationed in the lower levels reported strange dreams, visions of a deep, featureless darkness calling to them as though it recognized their deepest doubts. Some awoke with black stains on their armor, stains that could not be cleaned. Others found themselves overcome by sudden rage or despair, emotions that faded as quickly as they rose. They whispered these experiences to one another in secret, unsure whether they were descending into madness or witnessing something real. But the abyss makes little distinction between dream and waking. It uses both. The sealers, robed figures tasked with maintaining the flow of souls through the city, were among the first to realize the danger. These ascetic men and women had trained their minds to perceive minute shifts in soul resonance. For generations, they had monitored the pulse of New Lundo like physicians listening to a heartbeat. When the abyss began to thicken beneath the city, they sensed the disturbance immediately, a growing mass of wild humanity swelling below the foundations, like water behind a weakening dam. They approached the four kings with their concerns. The kings listened, but their thoughts were burdened by the serpent's prophecy. They believed they were preparing for the coming age, shaping a future where New Lundo would stand as humanity's guiding beacon. The sealer's warnings struck them as fear-driven resistance, clinging to the old order. And so, in a moment that would seal their fates, the kings dismissed the danger. Their faith in their own purpose outweighed their caution. The sealers knew they could not persuade their rulers. They withdrew into the upper chambers, recording every fluctuation they observed, marking the city's gradual descent into darkness. Their records describe the tipping point with chilling clarity. The moment when the abyss reached upward and began touching souls directly. By the time citizens noticed the change, it was too late. The abyss had no interest in drama. Its first touch was gentle, almost soothing. People felt a faint warmth in their chests, as though remembering something long forgotten. But warmth turned quickly to a consuming pull. Many felt their sense of self blur. Memories mingled with sensations that weren't their own. They saw faces in their sleep, sometimes their own, sometimes strangers. The city's priests stood before the altar, unable to speak, their tongues heavy with unformed words. Then came the transformations. Unlike the distortions in Oolacile, which reflected panic and denial, the creatures of New Lundo bore a different signature. They were not contorted by fear, but by purpose. Their bodies elongated, stretched thin, like shadows cast by a wavering flame. Their movements followed patterns that felt almost ritualistic, as though mimicking the four kings' altered forms. They had become reflections not of individual despair, but of collective devotion, twisted into something unrecognizable. Some still wore remnants of armor. Some clutched fragments of talismans or weapons, forgotten in their hands. Their faces, where visible, bore no rage. Their expressions were oddly serene, as if resigned to an inevitable transformation. This was the mark of a kingdom that did not fall to terror, but to trust, misplaced, unexamined, and ultimately fatal. As the abyss surged upward, the sealers realized the truth the kings could not admit. The corruption could not be reversed. Wild humanity, once freed, would not allow itself to be contained. The only way to prevent the abyss from spreading into the surrounding lands was to drown the city. A sacrifice unthinkable under normal circumstance became the only path remaining. They opened the floodgates. The waters roared into New Lundo with a force that shook the city to its core. Streets vanished beneath swirling currents. Homes filled instantly. Bridges snapped like twigs under the onslaught. Citizens who had not yet transformed were swept away before they could scream. Those already claimed by the abyss drifted beneath the surface, their forms shimmering faintly in the water, as if reaching upward for recognition. The four kings, suspended in the deepest chamber, disappeared beneath the rising tide, their spectral bodies glowing briefly before vanishing into the dark. The sealers stood atop the last intact parapet, watching the city drown. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They had sacrificed thousands to prevent the spread of a catastrophe no one had intended. The flood did not vanquish the abyss, for water holds no power over humanity's shadow. It merely buried it. Containment became their consolation, and history called it heroism because it had to. The aftermath left a silence more profound than the roar of the flood. The waters settled, dark and still, hiding the once great city beneath their weight. Only the faintest glimmers of light sometimes flickered in the depths, as if the ghosts of New Lundo still walked their drowned streets. The abyss continued to pulse below, quiet but unyielding. And in that quiet, the world learned something that would redefine every encounter with darkness that followed. The abyss cannot be destroyed. It can only be delayed. It waits, patient as stone, attentive as grief. It gathers where human souls accumulate. It listens for longing. It grows where hope and fear stand too close together. And though New Londo's sacrifice halted its spread, the abyss had already marked another path, one shaped by the echo of Manus, by the fall of Artorias, and by the fragmented truth carried by every human soul. The next chapter of its story would unfold not in drowned ruins or corrupted kingdoms, but in the lives of those who dared to question the order imposed by fire itself. Long before the abyss crept through Oolacile's trembling forests or pooled beneath the drowned arches of New Londo, long before the serpents whispered in chambers no mortal had ever mapped, the world was defined by a single division, a flicker of flame that split existence into opposites, light and dark, heat and cold, life and death, strength and frailty. From this first boundary, everything that followed became a negotiation between what the flame illuminated and what it concealed. And though the gods would one day claim dominion over the light, and though kingdoms would rise by the radiance of their power, the dark waited patiently at the edge of every fire, remembering what the world had been before the first flame divided it. To understand the abyss on a scale beyond Oolacile or New Londo, we must return to that earliest moment when the Furt flame appeared in the primordial fog. The everlasting dragons reigned then, their stone forms immune to time, their wings stretching across skies untouched by decay. In this stillness, the flames sparked, a phenomenon so novel that the world recoiled and expanded at once, reshaping itself around this anomaly. Gwyn seized the power of light and lightning. The witch of Izalith embraced flame with fierce mastery. Nito took death into his bones. And the furtive pygmy, unnoticed by the roaring grandeur around him, found, within the dark, something more subtle, an ember that would fragment into uncountable pieces and become humanity. From this origin, a truth emerges that the gods tried endlessly to obscure. Dark is not evil. Dark is not corruption. Dark is not a curse to be feared. It is simply the other half of existence. But when the gods linked the first flame to prolong their own era, they created an imbalance that would reshape how humanity related to its own nature. The dark, suppressed rather than understood, began to behave like a wounded thing, quiet, patient, gathering its strength in the hearts of mortals, remembering the ancient state before division. It is often said that the abyss was born in Oolacile through Manus, but that is only the form of its birth, not its essence. The abyss is what happens when dark is denied. When humanity, fragmented and scattered by the pygmy's ancient gift, tries to reclaim itself all at once. It is the place where suppressed truth breaks its chains, and it becomes most violent not where the dark is most present, but where it has been most smothered. This is why the abyss surged so violently in Oolacile, a kingdom of illusions built on the denial of shadow. It is why it blossomed beneath New Londo, where devotion to an ideal blinded rulers to the consequences of tampering with a power they barely understood. And it is why, in every age following, the abyss returned again and again, not as an invader, but as the echo of humanity's forgotten inheritance. As the first flame dwindled, the gods faced a terrifying realization. The dark would rise not as an adversary, but as a natural successor. The world was meant to transition into an age of dark, where humanity, born of the pygmy's soul, would guide existence by its own quiet strength, rather than the harsh radiance of fire. Yet Gwyn, unable to imagine a world beyond the one defined by his own kind, refused this transition. His fear of mortality, of dwindling light, of losing the dominance the gods had known for so long, drove him to an act that would stain history with a cycle of sacrifice. He linked the flame himself, burning his own soul to prolong an age that had already passed its rightful boundary. In this act, Gwyn created the first great fracture between humanity and its nature. He took the world's rhythm, light rising, dark returning, and forced it into a loop that could only be maintained through exploitation. His knights hunted the dark wraiths. His followers suppressed any knowledge of the pygmy or the dark soul. His children inherited a legacy of fear. That human darkness was something to be distrusted, something needing containment, lest it rise to claim its rightful place. This fear rippled outward for ages. Wherever the gods extended their influence, humanity learned to distrust the dark within themselves. Kingdoms built on fire shunned the idea that darkness could hold meaning. They forged rituals to cleanse it, to deny it, to cast it as corruption rather than inheritance. And so, inevitably, the abyss grew stronger, not because the dark itself was harmful, but because it was forced into unnatural confines, pressured until it warped from suppression. The abyss is not the dark. It is dark without balance. After the fall of Oolacile, the legends insisted that wild humanity was a catastrophic anomaly. Yet the truth lingering beneath these tales reveals something more complex. What Manus unleashed was not an aberration. It was an acceleration, a magnification of emotions that humanity had carried since the pygmies' first division of the dark soul. Grief, longing, anger, sorrow, hope. These emotions, unbound by the structures that shaped mortal life, accumulated until they twisted space itself. When the abyss touches a land, it does not simply corrupt its soil, it reveals what that land tried to hide. In Oolacile, it revealed their fear of darkness. In New Lundo, it revealed their devotion twisted into obsession. In later ages, it would reveal the secrets of kingdoms built on fire's fragile promises. As the first flame waned, through successive eras, its dwindling light created a sense of inevitability among those who dared to notice. Bonfires burned weaker. Gods withdrew. The boundaries between ages blurred. The world seemed to dim in ways no sorcery could brighten. And each time fire faltered, humanity felt the ancient pull of the dark stirring deeper within them, calling them back to a state of unity long denied. This is why so many kingdoms rose and fell, repeating the same errors. They built their foundations on a flame that could not sustain them and ignored the quiet truth of their own origins. The abyss was not their downfall. Their refusal to understand the dark was. When kingdoms weakened under the fading fire, serpents slithered from the depths with promises tailored to the fears of each age. Frampt whispered of duty, of linking the flame as a noble, necessary sacrifice. Koth whispered of destiny, of an age of dark where humanity might finally reclaim its place as rightful heirs to the world. Their counsel diverged, but both serpents recognized a deeper reality. The cycle could not continue without human action. Fire needed sacrifice. Dark needed acceptance. And so, the abyss became a teacher, harsh and relentless. Each manifestation revealed something about humanity's relationship with itself. In Oolacile, its lesson was that denial breeds catastrophe. In New Lundo, its lesson was that devotion without discernment becomes ruin. In the ruins that followed, its lesson would be that no kingdom can outrun its own nature. As the first flame's influence waned, the balance between light and dark sought restoration. But humankind, shaped by centuries of divine instruction, struggled to reconcile the dark within themselves. They feared it, misunderstood it, and resisted it until it broke free in forms too overwhelming to contain. This is what the abyss truly is: the recoil of the human soul against the weight of a lie. It is the moment when suppressed truth reasserts its existence. The more fire faded, the stronger this recoil became. Some scholars from later ages pointed out a fascinating paradox. In the deepest abyss, where light cannot exist, humanity's form dissolves not into nothingness, but into a collective shape, an undifferentiated mass of feeling, memory, and instinct. This suggested that the dark, when free from restraint, does not erase individuality for cruelty's sake, but merges it into something older and more universal. A return to a time before separation, before singular form, before identity splintered into countless lives. This is why the abyss often manifests as a longing, not a hunger. It reaches outward because it remembers what it was, one. It remembers the pygmy's ancient soul, unified before fragmentation. It remembers the silence that preceded the flame. It remembers the stillness broken by the gods' war against the dragons. The abyss does not yearn for destruction. It yearns for reunion. This truth casts every encounter with the abyss in a different light. Manus's rage becomes grief distorted. The Four Kings' downfall becomes devotion turned inward. The spread of wild humanity becomes an echo of a long-forgotten unity attempting to reclaim itself. And every hero who steps into the dark, whether Artorias or the chosen undead who would later follow him, faces not an enemy, but a story older than fire. And yet, in all of this, a single question lingers like a heartbeat beneath the surface. If the dark is natural, if the abyss is merely the consequence of imbalance, then what becomes of humanity when the first flame finally fades? Does the abyss swell across the world, reclaiming everything in its undifferentiated embrace? Does humanity rediscover itself as a unified whole? Or does the dark find a new shape, something not yet written in any chronicle? These questions linger unanswered as the cycle repeats. But from here, the story deepens further, moving from kingdoms swallowed by shadow to the very nature of the dark soul itself, the origin of humanity's fragmented essence, and the reason the abyss follows wherever people gather. Long before any kingdom drowned itself to contain corruption, long before Manus reached through trembling shadows in search of what he had lost, the world witnessed an act so quiet that even the gods overlooked it. In the age when the furt flame first divided existence into opposing forces, the furtive pygmy found something the others did not: a soul small enough to be dismissed, subtle enough to be forgotten, yet vast enough to shape the destiny of every mortal who would ever draw breath. This was the dark soul, the origin of humanity, the ember from which all mortal hearts would one day spark. And though chronicles across ages speak endlessly of mighty lords and blazing miracles, the true weight of this world lies not in the souls of gods, but in the countless fragments the pygmy scattered into the darkness. To understand the abyss, to understand why wild humanity bursts forth when balance falters, we must return to this moment of division. When the pygmy split the dark soul among his descendants, he did not fracture it out of greed or fear. He divided it because that was its nature. The dark soul was not meant to exist in singular form. It was meant to live within many, to disperse like seeds on a quiet wind, to take root in the hidden places where gods rarely looked. And so, humanity emerged, fragile in body, but vast in spirit, each individual carrying a piece of an ancient whole they would never fully comprehend. This division carries profound implications. The gods wield power as a single blaze. Humanity wields power through accumulation. A single human soul may appear small, beside Gwyn's lightning, or the Witch of Izalith's chaotic flame. But countless human souls, together, in resonance, form something the gods fear. Not a weapon, not a rebellion, but a truth. A truth older than fire. A truth the abyss continually reveals in its darkest moments. The dark soul, divided among many, longs to remember itself, and that longing is the seed of the abyss. Every fragment of humanity carries the echo of its origin. It remembers the undivided soul that once existed before the flame imposed boundaries. It remembers unity. It remembers silence. It remembers the state of the world before gods carved order from stillness. And though humans live as individuals, each carrying memories the others cannot access, each destined to struggle and fade, the soul within them yearns for reunion, a return to the shape it once held, even if that shape no longer has meaning in a world defined by duality. This longing lies dormant for ages. Most humans carry it softly, expressed only in melancholic dreams or in the desire for connection. But under certain conditions the gods never fully understood, the longing intensifies. It gathers. It concentrates. It stirs like a memory rising from the depths of sleep. Where fire wanes and kingdoms falter, this ancient memory awakens. And when it awakens too quickly or too violently, the abyss emerges. This is humanity reaching for itself with desperate urgency, trying to reassemble a soul that has been scattered beyond recognition. That is why the abyss is always preceded by intense emotion, grief, longing, fear, devotion. These emotions resonate with the dark fragments inside every human. They draw the pieces together, they amplify, they echo, they compound until the boundaries separating one person's humanity from another dissolve into a tidal wave of feeling too vast to remain contained within flesh. This is why the abyss is not simply a place, it is a gathering, a convergence, an unmaking of separation. When Manus awoke, his own grief ignited this process, drawing wild humanity toward him like a storm gathering clouds. When the four kings faltered beneath their devotion, their amplified humanity resonated with the souls of their people, pulling the entire kingdom into an emotional singularity. And when later ages spoke in trembling tones of pilgrims, serpents, and quiet hollow men who carried ancient fragments within them, what they described, often unknowingly, was the same truth. The dark soul remembers itself. And remembering is dangerous when hope and fear stand side by side. Consider how fragments of humanity behave across the lands touched by fire. They cluster in corpses, drawn to their sorrow. They flicker within bonfires, drawn to fading warmth. They float toward the lost and directionless, seeking resonance. They swarm to places where death lingers, for death loosens identity and awakens the ancient memory of unity. Humanity, in every age, behaves as if it seeks to reunite with itself. It remembers that it was once whole, but the world built by gods has no space for such reunion. It depends on separation, on identity, on individuality. This is what fire gave to mortal beings, a world where personhood matters, where names have meaning, where the self can stand apart from the whole. The first flame created distinction, and distinction made freedom possible, but freedom was born from a fracture, and the abyss is the fracture seeking to heal itself. This is what the gods feared most. Not darkness itself, but the loss of individuality that comes when the dark soul gathers without limit. To them, the abyss looked like annihilation. To humanity, it is something more complicated. It is a calling, a memory, a return. Yet humanity is not meant to return completely. Fragmentation defines mortal life. The self exists because the dark soul divided. Without that division, there would be no individuality, no choice, no story. And so humanity exists in a paradox, longing for reunion, yet thriving in separation. This paradox explains why the abyss both attracts and terrifies, why it empowers and destroys, why it reflects truth even as it consumes those who step too close. This is why the chosen undead, hollowed or not, is never fully consumed by the abyss unless their will collapses. Will is the anchor of individuality. It keeps the fragment from dissolving into the whole. Artorias lost this anchor. Manus lost it in the moment of his awakening. The four kings surrendered theirs willingly, consumed by devotion. But the chosen undead, regardless of which path they take, walks the line with uncanny resilience. Some scholars argue that this resilience is not heroism, but clarity. Those who understand their own nature, who acknowledge both light and dark within themselves, become less vulnerable to either extreme. They become a point of balance in a world where imbalance rules. This balance confers power, but it also brings burden. For to walk the boundary between flame and dark is to feel the pull of both. And those who choose one over the other do so, knowing they leave behind a part of themselves. When later ages speak of the abyss in new regions, shadowed churches, forgotten tombs, sunless realms where pilgrims walk with shells of remembrance on their backs, they describe the same pattern repeating again and again. Wild humanity gathers where people suffer. It gathers where people worship. It gathers where people die. It gathers where people dream. Because humanity remembers. It remembers the pygmy's ancient gift. It remembers the world before fire. It remembers the unity of the dark soul. And the abyss, for all its terror, is simply that memory made overwhelming. But as the cycle continues and kingdoms rise only to crumble beneath the weight of their own forgotten truths, another question emerges, one that touches not only the nature of humanity, but the shape of the world itself. If the dark soul longs for unity, and if the first flame demands separation, then what future can exist between these opposing truths? What fate awaits a world built on division, held together by denial, forever circling the moment when balance must be restored? To follow that question, we must look beyond dying kingdoms and ancient lords to those who walk the boundaries between ages, pilgrims, serpents, and forgotten heirs, whose journeys reveal how the abyss continues to shape the world long after its first emergence, long after Oolacile's final lantern was smothered by wild humanity, long after New Lundo's spires sank beneath crushing waters. The abyss did not rest. It drifted, patient and silent, searching not for kingdoms or battlements, but for the places where humanity gathered in greatest concentration, places defined not by stone, but by meaning. In these later eras, the abyss no longer needed a Manus or a monarch to rise. It grew in the hushed prayers of wandering pilgrims. It whispered through the coils of serpents who guided fate from the darkness between ages. It stirred in forgotten tombs, in crumbling archives, in the hearts of men and women burdened by secrets too ancient to name. And, as the first flame dwindled further, the abyss found new shapes, new voices, new ways of expressing the same ancient truth. Humanity remembers itself, even when the world tries to forget. In these twilight centuries, serpents slithered through history like living contradictions. Frampt, who served the gods, emerged from the deep earth with a message of duty, speaking of the need to sustain the age of fire even as its embers dimmed. Koth, who rejected the gods, offered an opposing truth. The age of dark approaches, and humanity must reclaim its rightful future. These beings, ageless and impossibly wise, saw what most mortals could not. They understood that the abyss was not an isolated threat, but the natural counterbalance to fire. They understood that as the flame waned, dark would rise, and they understood, better than any mortal, that the dark soul carried both promise and peril. What they did not understand, or perhaps did not care to admit, was the human cost of their guidance. Pilgrims, burdened by the pull of history, wandered through realms lit by fading bonfires. Some carried cocoon-like shells upon their backs, each shell a symbol of transformation, of metamorphosis, of a truth that could not be expressed in words. These pilgrim bearers did not serve kingdoms. They served remembrance. They walked toward places where the abyss had touched the world, or was destined to touch it, guided by intuition older than scripture. Their eyes dimmed, not by blindness, but by knowing, as though they had seen too much of the dark, or perhaps simply remembered too much of it. In some lands, these pilgrims gathered in abandoned churches where sunlight no longer reached. They whispered prayers that were less about salvation than about survival. Their worship was not directed at gods, but at what lay beyond gods, a truth they sensed in their bones, in the ancient fragments of the dark soul that shaped their very being. Some believed they were on a journey toward a forgotten king whose slumber might restore balance. Others believed they sought a fire to be rekindled or extinguished. But beneath every outward act, the same unspoken force guided them forward, the pull of unity, the memory of an origin that predates the flame. This quiet yearning made them susceptible to the abyss, and yet it also made them resilient. Those who walked willingly into darkness did not fear it. They recognized it as a reflection of their inner landscape, and so the abyss responded to them differently, not with violence, but with attention. It watched them, it tested them, it lingered around them like a long-forgotten friend, waiting for a moment when the boundary between self and shadow might blur. In some kingdoms, this blurring happened gradually. On distant isles, where ash fell like snow, hollow men drifted through half-remembered memories, their minds tethered to fading bonfires that no longer provided warmth. In these hollow figures, the abyss found fertile ground, their identities unraveled, leaving emotions raw and exposed. Yet even as these hollows lost themselves, humanity, the dark fragment within, shimmered faintly within their chests. When stolen or devoured, these fragments twisted the bodies of beasts and men alike, transforming them into expressions of longing or madness. And yet, even in this chaos, patterns emerged. Where fire weakened, serpents appeared. Where serpents appeared, pilgrims followed. Where pilgrims walked, the abyss stirred. The cycle repeated because the world had been structured to repeat. Gwyn's act of linking the flame created a loop in which fire would fade, dark would rise, and mortals would be manipulated into choosing between two extremes. Every age became a negotiation between maintaining an outdated order or surrendering to an unpredictable future. And in the spaces between these choices, the abyss grew, not as a threat to either side, but as a reminder of the balance that should have been. This balance becomes most visible in the lands where the abyss crystallized into recognizable forms, places where darkness took shape, not as formless void, but as creatures embodying echoes of humanity's collective memory. Consider the monstrous knights who patrolled sunless ruins, their armor fused with shadow, their movements heavy with the memory of oaths they could no longer recall. These beings were not simple victims of corruption. They were symbols of what happens when purpose endures beyond identity. Their loyalty survived, even when their souls dissolved into wild humanity, proving that some fragments of the self remain anchored even in the deepest dark. Or consider the towering figures who guarded tombs carved into the earth. Warriors who had once served lords, now forgotten by time. Their bodies swell with abyssal power, yet their stance remained protective, vigilant. They did not strike out of hatred. They struck out of duty. Their humanity, though subsumed by shadow, still held the echo of what they once were. Even the dark wraiths, those fearsome figures born from Koth's teachings, embodied a paradox of intention. They sought humanity not out of malice, but in pursuit of a purpose they believed noble, to accelerate the coming of an age of dark in which humanity would finally stand at the center of the world. Their hunger reflected more devotion than cruelty, and though their methods terrified those who encountered them, their underlying motive mirrored the same longing that shaped the abyss itself. Across these lands, one theme repeated. The abyss amplifies what already exists within the human soul. Where there is loyalty, it becomes obsession. Where there is sorrow, it becomes despair. Where there is hope, it becomes yearning too powerful to contain. And wherever humanity gathers in vast number, as pilgrims, as armies, as kingdoms, the abyss listens, not to conquer, not to punish, but to reflect the emotions that shape those lives. This reflection becomes especially apparent in the strange phenomenon observed by travelers who dared to approach sunless realms at the edges of the world. They described fields where shadows moved independently of the bodies that cast them. They spoke of whispering winds that carried fragments of forgotten conversations. They claimed that in the deepest quiet, one might hear their own thoughts repeated aloud by a voice not their own. A voice shaped not by malice, but by familiarity. These encounters reveal a deeper truth. The abyss does not erase. It remembers. It remembers grief that kingdoms sought to bury. It remembers loyalty that outlived its masters. It remembers dreams unfulfilled, prayers unanswered, love unspoken. It remembers the unity that existed before individuality defined existence. And this memory shapes the world in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Some scholars, desperate to reconcile these contradictions, argued that the abyss represents a kind of emotional gravity. Just as physical gravity pulls matter toward a center, emotional gravity pulls humanity toward remembrance, toward the pygmies' ancient unity. Under normal conditions, this pull remains balanced by fire, by individuality, by the structures that define mortal life. But when fire wanes or denial intensifies, gravity overwhelms structure, and the abyss rises like a tide, absorbing everything in its path. This gravitational analogy explains why entire kingdoms fall with such rapidity. It explains why even powerful beings like the Four Kings or Artorias could not resist once their emotional anchor broke. It explains why pilgrims walk with such solemn determination, as though drawn by a force older than destiny. But it also explains something more profoundly intimate. The abyss follows not because it hungers, but because humanity calls to itself. In some forgotten cathedrals, pilgrims carved symbols of eyes. Eyes open, eyes closed, eyes weeping. They believed these eyes watched over their journey, guiding them toward a truth they could not articulate. They were not wrong. The abyss sees through emotion. It sees through memory. It sees through the fragile space where longing becomes identity. This constant surveillance is not malicious. It is simply the nature of the dark. The abyss observes humanity because humanity is its source. Yet this raises questions that no kingdom, no scholar, no serpent has ever answered fully. If the abyss remembers humanity's origin, and if pilgrims walk toward that remembrance, then what lies at the end of their path? What awaits them in the spaces where shadow becomes memory made flesh? What shape does humanity take when it stands at the threshold of reunion? These questions lead into the heart of the cycle itself, into the conflict that defines every age. For beyond pilgrims and serpents, beyond drowned kingdoms and corrupted forests, beyond even Manus and the pygmies' ancient gift, lies a deeper tension. The endless struggle between fire's demand for separation and dark's longing for unity. And from that struggle emerges the true nature of the abyss, not merely as a force, nor a place, nor a corruption, but as the shadow of a world built on contradiction. Long before modern scholars argued over the meaning of linking the flame, long before serpents coiled their riddles around chosen heroes, the world entered a quiet tension that no kingdom could escape. It was the tension between separation and reunion, between the individuality granted by fire and the unity remembered by dark. This tension shaped every age, every rise and fall of empires, every prayer whispered to dying bonfires. And though the gods tried desperately to conceal it beneath rituals and grand mythologies, the truth remained unaltered. The first flame did not create the world, it divided it. And the abyss did not invade the world, it reminded it of what it had been. To understand why this tension spiraled into the cycles that define Dark Souls, we must look not at heroes or monsters or lords, but at the relationship between flame and dark themselves. Fire created boundaries, giving form to creatures, giving meaning to individuality. Dark, in turn, preserved memory. It safeguarded emotion, identity, longing, grief, everything that made humanity human. If fire is the architect of worlds, dark is the witness. Yet, when Gwyn linked the flame to extend the age of fire, he forced an unnatural continuation of division. He froze the world in a single chapter of its story, trapping generations in a twilight that felt endless, yet always threatened to collapse. From the moment Gwyn stepped into the kiln, burning his own essence to delay the inevitable, the tension became unbearable. Fire no longer waned naturally, it flickered violently, unpredictably. Dark no longer rose gently. It surged in places where emotion accumulated without direction. The abyss, born from imbalance rather than malice, began to manifest wherever the cycle's strain cracked the world's foundation. It knew only its purpose, to restore equilibrium. But in a world terrified of shadow, its presence was treated as calamity. Consider the undead curse. It did not originate as punishment or plague. It emerged as a byproduct of the cycle itself, a symptom of a world caught between fading fire and rising dark. When a soul loses its shape, when identity erodes under the weight of endless time, the body reflects this unraveling. Hollowness is not death. It is the dissolution of individuality, the very fate the abyss promises in its extremes. Thus, every undead is a living tension point between the self that fire shaped and the pull toward unity that dark remembers. The serpents understood this. Frampt encouraged heroes to delay the cycle's collapse by offering their souls to the flame. Koth encouraged champions to abandon the cycle entirely and embrace a future defined by humanity's unified essence. Neither serpent lied outright, yet neither told the whole truth. Their guidance followed two interpretations of the same ancient tension. Frampt saw safety in separation. Koth saw destiny in reunion. Both believed the other's path would lead to catastrophe, but the truth that lay beneath both visions was simpler. The world could not persist in endless imbalance. The flame would fade, whether linked or not. The dark would rise, whether embraced or feared. And humanity, divided into countless fragments, would continue to struggle, fall, rise, and remember. Throughout later ages, this struggle manifested in strange and unsettling ways. In distant lands where bonfires burned with eerie, cold light, pilgrims wandered with shells upon their backs, carrying memories that did not entirely belong to them. These shells, some believed, echoed the shape of an ancient being, the Lord of Hollows, or perhaps the pygmies' forgotten heirs. Each pilgrim looked inward as much as outward. Their journey was not simply physical, but metaphysical, a walk toward understanding the nature of the soul's fragmentation. Some arrived at grand cathedrals, where the air shimmered with dust and silence. Others reached shrines swallowed by darkness so thick it shimmered like tar. Still others found themselves lost in cities whose spires stretched toward a sky dimmed by a fading sun. Each location revealed a different reflection of the same truth. Humanity, fractured by fire, yearns for its own pieces. In some places, these pieces gathered into ghost-like masses that drifted like embers of shadow. In others, they condensed into monstrous beings whose forms mirrored the strongest emotions of those who approached them. These manifestations were not accidents, they were responses. The abyss behaves like memory given shape, and memory responds to presence. When pilgrims reached certain thresholds, the dark showed them visions of ancient halls built before the first linking, of cities swallowed by their own neglect, of shadows that walked without bodies, of faces that might have been their own in another age. These visions did not speak, yet they communicated through imagery older than language. They revealed the truth the gods feared. The dark soul was never meant to be bound to the flame's cycle. It was meant to guide the world into its natural successor, a time when multiplicity gave way to unity. This truth frightened those who clung to fire. And so, history repeated itself. Just as the knights of Leyndell once hunted dark spirits who threatened the flame's order, so too did later ages persecute pilgrims, hollowed figures, and any who bore signs of the abyss. Yet persecution only strengthened dark's pull. Suppression thickened memory. Fear sharpened longing. And in the spaces where emotions overwhelmed reason, the abyss gathered power. In lands scarred by war, where bodies lay forgotten beneath cracked stone, the abyss found fertile ground. The grief of the fallen pooled like liquid shadow, seeping into soil, feeding on unspoken regrets. Travelers reported seeing silhouettes wandering battlefields long after their bodies had crumbled. These apparitions were not ghosts, but imprints, humanity fragments remembering what had been taken from them. Every lost soldier, every broken oath, every unburied story fed the swirling tide of wild humanity that surged beneath the world's surface. In coastal regions where the water met forgotten ruins, the abyss sang through the currents. Sailors whispered that waves carried voices, some mournful, some pleading, some furious. They described shadowy forms slipping beneath the sea, their eyes glowing faintly like embers smothered by ash. These visions were dismissed as madness by scholars, yet they mirrored the same phenomenon witnessed in New Lundo centuries prior. Wherever human sorrow lingered, the abyss listened, echoed, amplified. Even in lands where ancient dragons roosted atop desolate peaks, the abyss crept. Dragons, remnants of a world before fire, cared little for the flame or the dark. Yet even they felt the pull when the dark thickened. Their roars, deep and trembling, sometimes carried a resonance identical to the vibrations felt when wild humanity gathers. This resonance suggested a profound truth. The abyss transcends eras. It reaches into the deepest past and the farthest future, remembering what the world was before division. Even beings untouched by the cycle, like dragons, can feel its reminder. As these manifestations grew, kingdoms scrambled to impose structure. They built archives to study the abyss, though few dared to read the texts they collected. They built catacombs to contain those who succumbed to hollowness, as if entombing the body could silence the soul. They built walls, temples, fortresses, all in desperate attempts to deny the dark its natural expression. But the abyss is not hindered by architecture. It flows through emotion, not stone. Some lands attempted to harness the abyss rather than suppress it. They forged weapons steeped in dark, believing they could control the essence that threatened their existence. They trained warriors to channel hatred, sorrow, or longing into strikes of shadow. They created rituals to bind the abyss to their will, yet every attempt ended the same way, with the dark amplifying the emotion that summoned it, until the wielder drowned beneath the weight of their own soul. This is the great irony of the abyss. It cannot be mastered because mastery requires detachment, and detachment dissolves in the presence of wild humanity. Still, the cycle endured. Fire faded, dark rose, serpents whispered, heroes emerged and fell. And yet, despite centuries of repeated patterns, one question remained unaddressed. What if the abyss was never meant to be feared? What if it was not destruction, but culmination? A return to unity distorted only because fire refused to yield. This question gained traction in isolated enclaves, places where scholars and wanderers dared to imagine a world beyond the cycle. They studied fragments of Manus' story, the Four Kings' fall, Artorias' sacrifice, and the pilgrim journeys etched into countless lands. And in these studies, they saw a pattern. The abyss behaves most violently when humanity resists its own nature. When embraced gently, through acceptance, through understanding, it becomes calmer, almost protective. Yet acceptance remains rare. Fear governs most choices. And so the abyss continues to echo through ages, waiting for a moment when the world might finally reconcile its fractured soul. The tension between fire's division and dark's remembrance remains unresolved. It shapes heroes and kingdoms alike. It shapes the hollows who wander in silence. It shapes serpents who slither between truths. It shapes pilgrims who walk toward horizons no map has charted. And it leads inevitably to a single fate, one that every age approaches, yet none fully understands. A moment when the cycle must break, when either fire relinquishes its hold or dark relinquishes its longing. To understand the final shape of the abyss, we must step into that moment, where endings and beginnings blur, where memory becomes destiny, and where the dark soul reveals what it truly desires. Continue. You said, continue sleep law. 10K script generator said, segment. 10. When all shadows become memory. Long after the last kingdom burned itself down to preserve the illusion of order, long after serpents whispered their final riddles into ears too weary to listen, the world approached a moment that no age had ever reached without turning away. A moment when fire no longer had the strength to define existence, when dark no longer needed to rise in violent bursts, and when humanity, fragile, wandering, hollowed, grieving, stood at the threshold between what it had been and what it might yet become. In this liminal quiet, the abyss did not roar as it had in Oolacile. It did not seep like it had in New Lundo. Instead, it waited, not as a predator, nor as a calamity, but as remembrance. A memory older than flame, older than lords, older than cycles. A memory of unity. To understand what the abyss becomes when the world ceases to deny its nature, we must return once more to the relationship that shaped every age. Fire divides, dark remembers. Fire gives individuality, but only for a time. Dark collects each fragment when the body fails. Fire creates meaning through difference. Dark creates meaning through connection. And so the world, in its final twilight, begins to understand a truth the gods feared and the serpents manipulated. Neither fire nor dark is meant to rule. They are meant to balance. And the abyss, the surge of wild humanity, emerges only when balance collapses. In the quiet where bonfires sputter with their last shimmering embers, the chosen undead stands alone, carrying the weight of every age on shoulders that have known both light and shadow. Around them, the world curls inward. Trees lean as though exhausted from centuries of holding their shape. Stones crumble into fine dust. The sky darkens not in menace, but in resignation, dimming like the final breath of a long-lived flame. This is not a world collapsing. It is a world exhaling. At the edge of this fading landscape, the abyss does not pulse or distort the air. It spreads softly, like a curtain drawn open after a long night of vigil. Its darkness is deeper than shadow, but calmer than void. It has no hunger left. It has no malice. It simply reflects. In its depths shimmer the traces of every soul it has ever touched. Faces half remembered. Gestures preserved in the quietest movements of shadow. Emotions drifting like dust caught in moonlight. It holds not terror now, but memory. Wild humanity, when freed from fear, does not distort. It clarifies. Fragments of sorrow lose their violence and return to stillness. Fragments of longing soften into recognition. Fragments of rage unravel into quiet truth. At last, the abyss behaves as it once did before fire imposed boundaries, as the natural gathering of the dark soul's divided essence. What had been chaotic now settles like water, finding its resting place. In this moment, the chosen undead feels something stir within them. Not corruption, not temptation, but resonance. The fragments of humanity they have carried through countless battles, in pockets weighed with loss and triumph, begin to tremble softly, as though recognizing the presence of their origin. It is not a call to surrender identity. It is not an invitation to dissolve. It is simply acknowledgement. A reminder that every soul, no matter how fractured, belongs to something older than division. The serpents fall silent. Frampt, whose zeal once burned like a torch, lowers his great, moss-ringed head as though accepting an outcome he cannot alter. Koth, coiled in the dark beneath forgotten ruins, closes his lidless eyes as if witnessing a prophecy fulfilled. Their purposes, both born from interpretations of truth rather than truth itself, have reached their limits. What comes next lies beyond their guidance. Around the chosen undead, memories of the world echo faintly. The laughter of travelers by early bonfires. The clash of metal in halls where knights once swore oaths to protect a kingdom now swallowed by shadow. The soft weeping of hollowed men who remembered too late who they used to be. The whispering prayers of pilgrims tracing steps that led nowhere and everywhere at once. These sounds do not haunt the dark. They illuminate it. The abyss, in this moment, becomes not a place, but a story. It reveals how every kingdom fell, not because dark was evil, but because light was afraid. How every tragedy emerged not from malevolence, but from imbalance. How every hero who walked into shadow did so carrying the hopes of a world that had forgotten how to listen. As the chosen undead steps forward, the boundary between fire and dark blurs. The abyss responds not with a surge, but with stillness, as though the world itself is waiting for an answer that has never yet been spoken. The first flame flickers nearby, fragile as a candle struggling against wind. It no longer demands sacrifice. It no longer commands destiny. It simply offers a choice made not out of manipulation or fear, but out of understanding. Link the flame, and the world will divide once more. Let it fade, and the world will remember itself. But in this final moment, the abyss reveals a third truth, quiet yet profound. Neither choice brings destruction. Fire will rise again one day in some form. Dark will gather again as it always has. The world's story is not a circle nor a line. It is a pulse, moving between division and unity like breath. What matters is balance. The chosen undead, silent, steady, shaped by countless fragments of lost and found humanity, feels this understanding settle like dust on old stone. The abyss at their feet no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a mirror, a memory, a home that was lost before anyone alive could name it. If they walk into the flame, the dark waits patiently for its time to rise again, softened by the understanding carried into it. If they turn toward the abyss, the flame dims without bitterness, trusting that one day it too will be remembered. If they walk between both, refusing to surrender entirely to either, the world continues, not in repetition, but in evolution. This is the final secret of the abyss. It was never the end of the world. It was the world recalling its beginning. And as the chosen undead steps into this understanding, whether toward fire or dark, or something held gently between, they carry with them the truth that every age forgot, that humanity's deepest shadow is not its curse, but its memory, that the abyss rises only when that memory is denied, and that even in the darkest depths, the human soul glows with a quiet, unyielding light,